Welcome to History Hack. If you didn't know by now, we are the revolution. That means we're sharp, witty, lots of fun, but it also means that we're essentially the peasants in Les Mis huddled round a table in the corner of the bar with no money. If you enjoy the show, please do support us. We have a Patreon account by which you can donate a small monthly sum in appreciation of what you're hearing. Alternatively, we have Ko-fi, in which you can just do a one-off donation as a thank you if you particularly enjoy a certain episode. Either way, we massively appreciate all of your support. Hope you enjoy the show. Hello and welcome to today's History Hack. It has been a long time since Alina and I buddied up on an ancient history podcast, hasn't it?
Oh dear, yes it has been, but we've got a really great guest today. Someone we've been chatting to for like 20 minutes before we're supposed to actually record. But Virginia Campbell.
Not safe for work version.
Well, this is it. But we've sussed out a couple of things that we do want to talk about. And she's back. Because we did Pompeii with her, my God, like at the beginning of our recordings, I think.
I'd say it was 2 or 3 years ago. I think it was during lockdown.
Yeah, so just when we started, we did a podcast with Virginia Campbell. Well, Virginia Campbell, she's an ancient Roman historian, archaeologist, author. She's published a really expensive book that I actually own, funnily enough, The Tombs of Pompeii, Organization, Space and Society. She's working on prostitution. She's working on politics. She's working on loads of really different stuff. But we're actually going to be talking about politics today anyway, which kind of fits in quite well to the modern perspective. Virginia, welcome to the podcast. Again.
Oh, thanks for having me. I enjoy talking to you always, so this is great fun.
We've not had Roman history for a little while. Alex is excited, actually, aren't you?
I'm more excited about the fact that I'm waiting to see if you sack off asking the first question so you don't have to be the first person to pronounce the Latin. Would you like me to do it?
No, I can do it. And even if I bollocks up, it doesn't matter. So I'm going to bollocks up just for everybody's entertainment. Right. So first question, are we ready?
Absolutely.
Right. What was the commentalorium, something along those lines, Petitionius? Did I say that right, Alex?
Yeah.
No, you got none of it right. You could not have got it more wrong. Is it commentariorum? No, Coronariolum Petitionis.
That sounds better to me. You put the stress on the wrong syllable.
You've got a nickname for it, though, that helps everyone, haven't you?
Well, yeah, everybody just in English is referred to as the Handbook of Electioneering, so I just will call it the Handbook, and that's the easiest way to talk about it.
Well, tell us who wrote it.
Yeah, so it's actually really interesting because it's one of those texts that like we think we know who wrote it, but we're not entirely sure. So ostensibly, it's written by Quintus Tullius Cicero, who is the younger brother of the more famous Marcus Tullius Cicero, and in the idea from the way the text is written is it's presented as if it is written by Quintus in a letter form, a very, very long letter, to his older brother when Marcus is running for consul in something like 65, 64 BC. So he gets elected to consul in 63, or he is the consul in 63, which is why it's thought that it is dated to that election period the year before.
Do me a favour, say Cicero 5 times in a row, and if Linda's listening, I just want this to be embedded in her brain. She hates Cicero, and I find it entertaining that if she ends up listening...
really, really annoying. And yet, at the same time, I keep going back to his writing, and it frustrates the hell out of me.
He's an asshole.
Yeah, you know, in the one of my favorite things about the HBO BBC Rome series is simply the fact that Cicero is just a smarmy little asshole throughout the entire thing. Like the actor portrays that assholery so perfectly that you just think, yeah, this is exactly how Cicero must have been.
We're actually going to get Catherine Edwards to come on. She's going to do a whole thing on Cicero back to front, hopefully, and we can rip the piss out of her. She was doing Pliny, I think, at a certain time, and now she's doing, I can't remember, but she's doing something along those lines. So we're going to get her to talk about exactly who Cicero. I'm going to get Alex on that as well, just so we can rip the piss out of Cicero.
God, he is a bit up himself, isn't he? Oh yeah, no, he's kind of sanctimonious, really quite sanctimonious. Actually, when I gave a paper talking about this book, I like as an aside, I referred to Cicero as being affable, and then I was like, I'm probably the first person in 2,000 years to describe Cicero as being affable. Not that he actually was, more just like the point that he's being told that he should be a nice guy. So clearly, his brother knows he's an asshole.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's get back on track.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
talk about this of electioneering. So, why are we debating it?
Yeah, so here's the thing. Here's the thing that's really interesting. So there's stuff in the book. There are a bunch of questions about the book. So Quintus is the younger brother. He's never run for higher office. So the first thing is like, well, how does he know how to run for consul if he's never run for consul? Like, why is he giving advice if he's never done it?
Hold on a second. And that's like, I don't know, a BA student giving advice to, I don't know, professor or something, or someone that knows nothing about on history and calls Alex out on Twitter a million times in a row.
I was gonna say it's totally like, well, it's not, he's not quite as uninformed because he has been in like one of the lower, was he already quaestor or something like that, at that point he'd been in an election, so it's not like he was completely, it's like the people on Twitter who say things to like professors and stuff like, oh well, you clearly aren't familiar with this person's work and this says this, that, and the other, and it's like, actually that's me and that's not what that says. But that kind of calling someone out and giving advice. So that's the first question about it. The second is that there are things that are in it which, first of all, come across as being like really quite cynical, which they're kind of like, well, would that be embarrassing to the brothers? And also that there are little bits of information about like how certain trials have been handled or whether Cicero is acting for this particular person in a trial that's coming up. And it's sort of like, because Quintus actually says in the very last section of it, like the very last thing is, let me know if there's anything that I've left out of this that you think is really important, because I want it to be like this perfect thing, which makes everybody go, oh, well, clearly he was planning to publish it. So if he was planning to publish it, why would you put anything in there that might be a little bit controversial or embarrassing for the brothers themselves? So that's one part of the debate. There's also, there's also stuff. So there's this one guy who's written a ton of stuff about it. And his whole theory is that it's a parody written by somebody else in the style of Cicero in the imperial period, as a way of basically like a satire on how awful elections were in the Republican period. Which just strikes me as, there's a number of aspects to that argument, but it doesn't read like any other kind of parody or satire. So that doesn't really necessarily hold water. There's still elections, and certainly like in places like Pompeii, where I mostly work, there's still elections and hotly contested elections well into the imperial period happening elsewhere, other than the city of Rome. So like once we have an empire, an emperor, things change in the city of Rome, but they don't change elsewhere. So like every town, every city still has annual elections. And that's still a big deal.
What is it with some historians and saying ridiculous stuff just so that they sound,
I really don't know.
Like they've spotted something that nobody else has, like even if it's ridiculous.
The third part of the argument, which is really the longest part of the argument, is about the fact that, and we'll obviously get into more about like what the handbook actually says, but it says a lot of stuff about making using really superficial friendships and all of these other things. And so this person's argument is sort of like, well, the Romans didn't view friendship that way. Even Marcus Cicero, wrote a whole long philosophical treatise on friendship. And so the idea of Romans like tarnishing this noble thing of friendship is just completely beyond what he could comprehend as actually being true. And that's the thing that I thought was the most ridiculous, because I was just sort of like, why do some historians put Romans up on this pedestal like they're somehow better than everybody else. And like, they're more noble in their behavior and they're this wonderfully evolved. And I'm like, honey, please, human nature's not changed in 2,000 years. Politicians are assholes now. They were assholes then. You know, that's seems pretty standard to me. And that's, it just strikes me as being absolutely ridiculous that there should be now. Was this actually written by Quintus? Certainly it was written by somebody who either was a Cicero or knew the style that Cicero's wrote in very, very well. And I mean, there are examples of like students who would write things in the style of an earlier well-known like orator or writer or something like that. So that's something like a school exercise that people would do like in the imperial period. That's possible. But it just, there are too many details and there are too many little things that just make me think, yeah, this is absolutely done between brothers. And maybe it was something that they actually worked on together, which was why there's some bits that actually seem to be almost, they're like a couple sentences here and there that seem to be the same language that Marcus Cicero has in other texts, and things and certain, yeah.
These people heard of Occam Razor or ever read Sherlock Holmes? Like, sometimes the easiest answer is just the answer.
That's what I always say about ancient, like history generally, like, you know, and I say this to students all the time, like, be logical about things. Like, why make this whole convoluted argument about something when the simplest thing probably is true, is right, you know? So, I mean, there are plenty of examples of there are plenty of examples in the handbook where it's like, I know this is kind of not how you would normally behave, and this is a bit distasteful. And there are plenty of examples in other pieces of ancient literature written by a number of different people, including, you know, Marcus Cicero, where it's like, yeah, we know electioneering is really quite awful, and none of us really like to do it. We don't like the way we have to behave, but we need to do this to get elected.
There's also that same argument of don't portray our modern perspectives onto an argument. Like the whole, I'm so going to bring this up, Pompeian penises. You know, there's a penis on every corner. It doesn't mean there's a sex workhouse or there's, you know, everybody's having an orgy on every street corner just because there's a penis there.
Yeah, I mean, this is the whole thing. The fact that the phallus is ubiquitous in antiquity, and it has nothing to do with sex necessarily. But that, like, dispelling those myths is so difficult. So dispelling the myth, like the idea of these, you know, amazingly proper, noble men wandering around in their white togas discussing politics and philosophy in some, you know, some high level and behaving always in the utmost perfect way. I mean, we know that politics got really dirty and violent at times. We know people, you know, were engaged in bribery and violence in the streets and, you know, mob mentality and all of that kind of stuff. There are politicians who did this. We know that people, you know, were involved in some really pretty shitty stuff as part of politics in the Roman world. So to behave like that or have that view that is the exception and that the norm is something really highbrow, I think is quite ridiculous.
So we've looked at what it is and the issues that historians seem to be creating for themselves around it. Let's just assume it is just a handbook. So in that instance, it would be a really useful snapshot into the subject at that given time when it was produced. So there are 3 sections, aren't they? So the first is about the campaign, isn't it? So what does that tell us?
Yeah, so one of the things that's really interesting about Cicero's whole campaign, Marcus Cicero's whole campaign, and what happens is that both the brothers are what are considered novo homo, so they're new men, which means that they don't come from a long line of people who have been in the Senate and consuls and stuff. So they come from one of those families where, you know, there's money, they're of fairly good stock more or less for the last several generations, but nobody's been elected to that high office. Nobody's had that kind of role before. So in the very first part, Quintus addresses his brother very specifically and talks about his campaign specifically, and the fact that he is a new man, and the things that are both the hurdles he'll have to overcome because he's a new man, but also the benefits he has because of what his career has been so far, and who knows him and what he's done. And like, because basically he's made a career as a lawyer, and has defended or prosecuted lots of very prominent people, including other people who have been consuls and, provincial governors and all of these things. And so he's going like, you have a name, people admire you for your rhetoric and your, all your abilities. So like, you have these advantages, even though you're a new man. And then he goes into kind of like, he talks about the campaign, the other candidates that are running, all of whom are people who come from long-standing senatorial families. So that's the difference.
And let's stick with that one. You've brought it up. Tell us about some of these candidates they actually talk about. Who do they mention? Why are they important? What are they talking about them?
Okay, well, there are 3 other candidates. So there are 2 roles for consuls. So basically, you've got 4 men running for 2 jobs. And it's just the way the Roman system works. Whichever 2 people get the most votes win. So the one that you will have most likely heard of is Catiline, because Catiline takes massive umbrage to the fact that he doesn't get elected. And in 62, we get the Catiline conspiracy, and there's this whole plan to potentially overthrow the government and kill the consuls and all of these other things, and basically have for lack of a better, a coup d'etat and get rid of the current consuls, including Cicero. And that becomes a whole thing which goes on to impact Cicero's later career because of the way he handles it. And there's like a mini war and all kinds of stuff goes wrong. So Catiline's probably the most famous of the others. We also have... Oh, sorry, there are 4 other candidates. Did I say 3? There are 4 other candidates. We also have the guy who actually is the other person who wins, and that's Gaius Antonius Hybrida, who is really not well known probably for anything other than the fact that he's the uncle of Mark Antony. I mean, he's really quite out of, like, silent and not really a huge presence during the year he and Cicero are consuls together. And then we have, and this is from the names as Quintus gives them in the book, we have Publius Galba. And I don't know anything else about that particular individual or which one of the family it is, other than he had an ancestor who was a consul in the 2nd century and, general and did a few things. So like, if you go to Google Publius Galba, you get the ancestor. So he seems to be fairly not that important, but he comes from one of those long-standing consular families. And the final one is Lucius Cassius. So I'm assuming that's a Lucius Cassius Longinus, which is the long-standing family name. There was, again, one who had been consul. He was consul in 107 with Marius. This is the ancestor. And he himself he's got some like minor governmental positions and different roles at different times. At one point, I think so he is in the Senate, and his brother, who's Gaius Cassius Longinus, is actually one of the conspirators who's involved in murdering Caesar. So you can see from that, like just what I've just said, all those other candidates have those ties within the Senate and have had previous ruling family members and other family members who are quite important and all of these things. And the Ciceros don't. So it's just them. And when they're discussed, and they're not discussed for very long, but they are discussed for a bit. When they're discussed, basically, it's like they're being just torn apart for how crap they are. Really, Quintus refers to them. So he says, he's saying like basically like how shit these candidates are. So like even if they come from these aristocratic, senatorial families, He says two of them are assassins from boyhood. They're both libertines. They're both paupers. And they're just the kinds of competitors you should be having because you're a man of energy and industry and a blameless life and an eloquent speaker. So you'll be fine against these guys because they are just such wastes of space.
I'm waiting for Alex to put in a comment here.
It sounds like a douche. They both sound like douches. It's like a snapshot of douchiness in ancient Rome. I mean, I'm glad they left it behind because it means like we learn stuff, but
I mean, but
they do not sound like the kind of people you'd want to go for a drink with, do they?
No,
I don't think that'd be very much fun. But at the same time, like that kind of invective against the candidates is exactly what we see. Like that's the standard in a lot of speeches, but also in the legal cases. So like in the law courts, which of course, Marcus that's how he makes his career, is either defending or prosecuting people. Like you don't win based on the law. You establish that your client is better than the other one, like a better person. This all comes down to image. Everything comes down to image. So, like for example, there's a case a number of years later where Cicero is defending a man who's accused of stealing gold and trying to poison a woman. And rather than go like present any facts about, well, actually, we haven't really found the gold and we don't really know what's going on and what was it. He basically spends, this is in the Pro Caelio, he basically spends half the time slut shaming the woman. I mean, there's no other way. He basically just like, oh, she sleeps with anybody, even possibly including even like he makes this like slip where he refers to her brother as her husband and like, oh, well, that's just because, I confuse the two, like he's suggesting they're incestuous. He just tears her apart for being a whore, basically. And I mean, this is, and again, like an aristocratic, upstanding woman. Yes, she has not the greatest reputation according to our historical sources, but, Cicero is one of them. But it's like, rather than go, oh, there's no way like my client did this thing because he was somewhere else at the time or he has an alibi, it's like, no, let's just tear apart the main person who's accusing him. So if we completely tear apart the character of the person accusing him, then clearly my client is fine. And that's the way they did stuff. So I mean, like if you think about stuff like it's Cicero, like the Philippics, which are all of the speeches he gives against Mark Antony. This is much later. This is like after Caesar's assassination and everything else. I mean, that's the style, is to just like tear somebody's character apart. So yeah, that's what Quintus is doing, is he's basically just going, well, all the other candidates are shit. You're so much better than them.
Like you say, human nature hasn't changed. Why make an educated argument when you can just trash your opponent?
Well, yeah, it's mudslinging. It's classic like political mudslinging.
So our third section is advice on canvassing.
Yeah, so it's basically like, this is how you should get people to vote for you. And it goes through, it kind of is in sort of two different sections, that third bit. And the first bit is like people you already know. And the second bit is people you don't know yet. So there's a whole lot of stuff about how to make friends, who the right people are to get on side. So like not just people who might already be senators or consuls or magistrates of a high level, but also to look for, so Romans voted in blocks that are called tribes. So find out who's in charge of each tribe and go make friends with them because they'll influence the other people in their tribe. Use all of those people. So anybody who you've ever done a favor, call in those favors they owe you. Use your networks of your neighborhood, your any like collegia or, you know, like guild or religious group you belong to, any kind of group that you're part of, call on those other people in the same group. Make sure you actually use there's even a bit like use your family, use your slaves and freedmen, because they will talk to other slaves and freedmen. So make sure you treat them well and are behaving a certain way at home, because people will talk. So it's even like using those, you know, using the slaves in your household. No doubt that probably also includes the women of your household, even though it doesn't say that explicitly, but, you know, everybody talks, right? And women's networks are certainly something that are hugely important. And we see that play out actually in kind of later in the Republican periods, like at the end of the Republican period. It's the female networks that are doing all of the stuff to like kind of behind the scenes after Caesar's assassinated and trying to work stuff out and all of those things. And we do get some evidence of that on, you know, in other letters of Cicero and things like that. But then he also goes through all the stuff about like, these are the people that you should cultivate in other places outside of Rome. And when you meet new people, make sure you remember their names. There's a whole thing about remembering names and whether you have the mind to remember all of the names of the random people you meet, or you need some slave or freedman whispering names in your ear because you can't remember them. And how best you can, you should try and remember people's names, because people like that. They like that you recognize them. It's all that kind of... I'm sorry?
Sorry, I was just going to say, can I just quickly segue? You mentioned women. Is there an unjustified assumption that women have no agency in voting and electoral process because they can't vote? And is it wrong?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a total kind of, some scholars more than others who I completely disagree with, who basically discounted women, but also people like I've just mentioned, like slaves and some of the, you know, less wealthy freedmen and things like that, as not having any interest or say or influence. And the evidence we have certainly from places like Pompeii is completely against that. We have women, we have all sorts of who put up electoral notices on their own without men. And there has been some study of the texts themselves and go, actually, there's no formulaic difference. They also seem to be done by professional sign writers. There's nothing to suggest that they aren't just as important. We have some candidates who are supported by multiple women. So there's clearly women are taking, at least on a small town level. And I mean, I don't see why we can't extrapolate that further on the larger level. You know, this is one of the things that people can be so interesting and yet so problematic about Pompeii, is we have so much evidence there because of, you know, Vesuvius and the eruption and the way things were preserved. But then people act like that's somehow unique to Pompeii and like, oh, well, this just happens in small towns. Well, no, actually, we have lots of literature that suggests there was tons of political graffiti in Rome itself. It just doesn't survive to us. You know, so there's no reason to say that there weren't women doing similar things in Rome, in Ostia, in, you know, Aquileia, in anywhere else. We just don't have physical evidence. And it's that whole thing of, you know, again, that not being logical about it. Like, just because if women are engaged in politics in Pompeii, which they very clearly are, then to assume that they're not also engaged elsewhere is just stupid. But, you know, we all know and I mean, yes, different levels and all of those kinds of things. But I mean, like, we all take interest in politics, even if we can't vote. You know, I've lived in the UK for more than 20 years now, and I've only been able to vote for about 6 or 7 of them. That does not mean that I wasn't interested in politics. That does not mean that I didn't pay attention. You know, it was simply a matter of not being a citizen yet, you know, so that changes things. That doesn't, I have the ability to vote now, but that hasn't, my interest in politics has not changed a single bit from before I could vote to now.
Well, that's that historian told then, isn't it?
Yeah, you know, a few of them, but yes.
They can do
1-0 Virginia.
I want to add one comment quickly before we move on to the next question, that the idea of getting people onto your side, women and slaves and everything else, we did a podcast with Mary Beard and I read through her book. I mean, I'm moving from the Republic to the Empire now, but it's this idea that it's been, people don't think it actually happened, but it was written down that Emperor Augustus, every time he'd enter the Senate, he would spend the whole 2 hours greeting every single senator. And then when he'd leave, he'd greet, and he knew everyone by name and everyone by face. And it's this sort of good public image that you have of yourself to keep people interested and on your side and things like that. And it kind of works, even though it's probably not true.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, I mean, that's one of the things that going back to the whole debate about the authenticity of the text itself and who wrote it, one of the other things is there's this throwaway line about using, the slave or whoever to remind you of names. And Quintus makes some comment like Marcus doesn't need this. And so this has been interpreted to be because we know he gave all these speeches and he's so famous for his orations and blah, 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 blah. So maybe he just has a really good memory and he's really good at remembering everybody's name, so he didn't need one. And then it goes on this whole debate about how important it was and whether it actually looks bad if you need somebody to whisper somebody's name in your ear. And I suppose it's the same thing that okay, this is going to sound like a really, really weird example, but today in the UK, when people, when sports people or actors or anybody else like this who gets some kind of honors from, I was about to say from the Queen, from the King, gets made a dame or sir or whatever else for something that they've done, like contribution to sport or theater or education or whatever it is. And whenever they're interviewed afterwards, they're always well, whichever royal it was that gave them the thing, knows who they are and talks to them a bit about why they've gotten the thing. Right. And so they all feel oh, this person, King Charles, Prince William, whoever knows who I am and knows something about me. And that's a really gratifying thing. Right. There's somebody with notes on a whispering in their ear just before that person comes up. Right. I mean, they're being prompted, but it is that connection of feeling oh, this person knows who I am. They know what I've done. And Quintus actually even talks about that. He talks about how there'll be young men who will come to the house of politicians, as part of the morning greeting ritual thing, but how they'll go to lots of different people's houses because they're trying to make up their mind. And he actually says, talk to them and make them know that you've seen them and you recognize them and that you're interested in them. And they'll remember you for doing that. And they'll stop going to the other people's houses and they'll be yours. So I think that, yeah, I mean, so that whole story that, Mary Beard might have said about Augustus greeting every senator by name and taking the time to do that. Yeah, I think that, I mean, whether, like you said, whether that's true or not, the perception of this exalted person knows who I am and knows something about me, it's, even if you know that, yeah, there's somebody behind them with note cards going, oh yeah, and this is this person who did this thing, it makes you feel special. You can't help that reaction. Again, we go back to human behavior, right? You can't help that, oh, I was noticed.
Yeah, it's the whole handshaking thing with the American presidentials as well, isn't it? The fact that any presidential candidate will not be able to feel his hand by the end, or her hand by the end of the campaign trail, because it's that fixating on someone's baby, shaking their hands, acknowledging them personally is part of the deal.
And there's evidence that the Romans did that to some extent, because there's this great story about oh god, now I can't find it. There's a story of this guy who is shaking hands. Oh yeah, so he's shaking hands with somebody, and it's a guy called Publius Scipio Nascia, and he's standing for aedileship. He's really young, and he shakes somebody's hand, and it's some guy who's like a farm worker, so his hands are really rough, like calloused from the work. And he makes a joke about like, did he get his hands get that hard because he's been walking on his hands? And like everybody gets pissed off about it. And basically are just like, it caused him to actually be defeated because like the rural tribes were like, oh, he's making fun of our poverty.
So there's a George V one from World War One where he is at a factory and this guy, he wants to shake hands with this guy, and he does, and it's a worker, and the guy left an account of it where he basically says, and he's so impressed because his hands were covered in oil, he shook the king's hand, he got oil all over the king's gloves, and George V didn't even flinch. He didn't.
That's a good politician.
Yeah, he did. The fact that the guy, he's like, I messed up his gloves, and he couldn't have cared less. He wanted to shake my hand, and the guy's dead impressed.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good politician. And that's exactly what Quintus is telling Cicero to do. Be the good and it's really interesting because he makes, and this is one of the things that I find so intriguing, and this goes to that whole, argument about whether or not it's a real text and it doesn't show the Romans or the Ciceros in very good light and all of these things. There's a line where Quintus actually says, I think it's when he's talking about friendship and how you can, manipulate people, or who you should try to cultivate friendships with and all these things while you're being a candidate. And he basically says, this thing is what a good man would do. This thing is what a good candidate would do. So he draws that line that they know there's a difference between how you're expected to behave normally and how you're expected to behave when you're a candidate, and what will get you elected.
I mean, we've already been kind of touching on the idea of modern politics. We might as well just jump into that, really. So, should we actually view Roman politicians with the same sort of cynicism that's more typical of today? Or should we just leave it all in the past?
I'd say there are parallels. I do think there are parallels. I'd say the handbook itself could basically be used at any time by anybody. I really, particularly like the last section with all the advice about cultivating networks and friendships and making promises, and even if you don't intend to keep them, and all these other kinds of things, I think are really, really work for politics in any place and time. There's a difference because, so in the Roman world, we don't have political parties. And while occasionally an individual might have like a particular issue or thing that they're very much well known for, potentially even before they get elected, in terms of like a platform or a policy, very rarely is that actually something that's happening. There's really nothing about political ideas. It's really more about who is seen as being a good person, a good candidate, who will run things properly. So it's all about that image and that perception of who is a better person and who is more likely to do well. And so in that regard, it really doesn't map on to modern politics, because I don't think we generally, there's an aspect of, there's such an aspect of popularity, of like who you like or who you don't like. I can't tell you during the election in 2020 how many times I heard people say on both sides of the ponds, I know Trump isn't qualified, but I just don't like Hillary. Right? So it's that it's like, I know Trump will be a disaster, but I just don't like Hillary. And it's kind of like, It's like, it doesn't really matter if you like them. On some level, it doesn't matter if there's somebody you want to go have a cocktail with. It's about whether or not they can do the job. And in that sense, that aspect still, kind of, I think, plays out. And the thing that gets me the most, the thing that I think is the most similar is there is this whole bit where Quintus goes on and on about making promises. So if somebody asks you for something, if you can do it, great, say yes, you can do it. Even if you can't do it, maybe you should say yes anyway. And that is because if later, after you're elected, you can't do that thing, what are they going to do? You've already been elected. But if you say no now and piss them off, then they might not vote for you. And I think that's something that maps on really, really well, because how much of people's campaigns is, I'm going to do this thing for you, even though I have no intention of doing this for you. It's £350 million a week to back to the NHS with Brexit. It's bringing back jobs and making America great again, whatever the fuck that's supposed to mean, because I don't think anybody's figured that out yet. Trump did this. He played to places, he kept saying he was going to bring back jobs and things like coal mining. Well, nobody wants coal anymore. So that was never going to happen. And anybody with half a brain would be like, well, no, that's never going to happen. But the people who were out of work and live in those parts of the country ate it up, because that catered to what they wanted and what they needed. And so that idea of saying virtually anything to get yourself elected is something that I think just totally carries across. And maybe I'm being really cynical here about politics generally in both time periods, but I do think that there's, from what the handbook says, there's definitely, there is a lot of kind of cynicism in it, and just going, say what you need to, make friends with people, do whatever you can to get yourself elected. Present yourself in this way so that you are, affable and friendly and authoritative, and are going to do everything for people that people want, and you'll get elected.
Virginia, I love having you on and love your passion, first of all, because I think it's awesome. Love your cynicism. And I've never heard of the Electioneering Handbook. So this, for me, has been an eye-opening experience, being able to learn about something new, especially in the Roman period, especially in the Roman Republic, because I personally prefer the emperors. I find that far more exciting than the Republic. But we will definitely have you back on, because I think we should do some more Pompeii stuff, because, well, I never get tired of Pompeii, really. And Alex is going to smash her head against the wall and go, for God's sakes, find something else in Rome. Stop it. Just stop it.
No, I'm not, because, it does make me laugh, because I've been there. And when people go, oh, have we not said everything there is to say about Pompeii? No, it's massive. Don't be a dick.
And you know what? They're digging up new stuff all the time now. There's just been, they're working in a new region that hasn't been uncovered before, and some of it's been, and this new villa that was being looted, that they've been working on for the last couple of years, and they found more human remains, and they found all kinds of stuff. What is it, like two years ago now? They found a tomb with an actual skeleton in it. There are no tombs with skeletons in Pompeii. It's completely thrown everything out that we thought we knew about tombs in Pompeii.
Oh, we have to do that. Tombs in Pompeii. Oh, that would be a really good one. Because there's a couple of tombs that anyway, no, stop it, because we're supposed to be wrapping.
We can just go on.
We will get you back. We will do something fun. Maybe we can get you and Sophie Hayes out there right now, so we could do something really fun.
Oh, that would be great fun. Sophie's amazing. Right.
Just remind our listeners the name of which one was it? The Graves book.
So the Tombs of Pompeii, Organization, Space and Society. And the book I'm currently writing, I can't remember what it calls it.
It's okay. Don't worry.
It's something like It's something like what did I call it? How to vote in the Roman world. It's about political processes in Pompeii and beyond. So there's not. I mean, it's not just going to be stuff like this handbook, but a lot of things like I've got all sorts of things about like literacy and like the actual physical act of like voting. Like, what do you write down? How do you do that? Where in the city do you do that? Because we don't actually know for places like Pompeii where people actually voted, and all that kind of stuff. So that's what I'm working on right now.
Well, we'll get you back to do that because we can do something more specific when the book comes out. And in the meantime, we'll just get you to do some Pompeii stuff because...
No, absolutely. Anytime.
We talk more about women in the process just to drive it home as well.
I'd love to do, I mean, I've been doing a lot more with women recently because I've also been teaching a class on Roman women, which has gotten me thinking more and more about various stuff. So there's all kinds of things about women that we could definitely talk about at some point, and kind of perceptions and misconceptions and things about women in the Roman world generally. I'd love to do something with that.
I'm not going to do Chris's spiel because I never can do Chris's spiel at the end to do with the river and books and bookshops and things like that. So I'm going to leave it at that because I suck at it. Unless Alex can do it.
Oh, the one about Jeff Bezos not needing any more money because he's got like enough money to go to space. So buy your books through us instead, because we categorically do not have enough money to go to space or even to go to the pub right now. So yeah, and obviously Virginia gets her cut as well. But
by like a couple of pence per book. Yeah, I was going to say there is a paperback version now. It's a lot cheaper.
Oh, yay. Do I need another copy? No, I do not.
No, but for anybody who doesn't have a copy yet, the paperback is considerably less expensive.
I'm in. Virginia, thanks so much.
Oh, anytime.